On a calm September morning in 1984, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics embarked on the largest and most daring military operation in human history, the invasion of the continental United States. In the opening wave of the attack, tens of thousands of crack Soviet airborne forces entered the country, their aircraft disguised as commercial charter flights. These paratroopers seized critical airports, helped secure important beachheads, or were scattered across much of the American heartland to sow confusion and disrupt enemy supply lines. Simultaneously, U.S. Strategic Air Command was crippled by Cuban infiltrators who had illegally entered the United States after a socialist revolution in Mexico. These initial strikes paved the way for the main offensive. Soviet-equipped armies from Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, and other Latin American states swept across the Great Plains, while 3 Soviet army groups consisting of 60 divisions crossed the Bering Strait, cut critical pipelines in Alaska, and moved across Canada to complete a continent-sized encirclement. By the time the front lines stabilized, American and Allied forces had halted the Soviet advance in the Rocky Mountains in the west and the Mississippi in the east. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign power had occupied American soil, and nearly a third of the country was forced to endure a hostile military occupation. Internment camps sprung up across the occupied territories. Collaborationist politicians worked alongside Soviet authorities, and the KGB created an atmosphere of terror and repression, arresting all those they considered a possible threat. Yet, in spite of it all, there were some who resisted. Around the town of Calumet, Colorado, Soviet soldiers who ventured into the neighboring mountains never returned. Across the highways, supply convoys were ambushed, and on the burning wrecks of Soviet vehicles was emblazoned a single word: Wolverines. A partisan group comprised mainly of high school students, the Wolverines lacked any sort of formal military training, and instead relied on their experiences in recreational hunting and their familiarity of the local area. While their earliest attacks on Soviet occupation forces were clumsy and sporadic, in time, the group had gained enough experience to practice sophisticated hit-and-run tactics, multi-staged ambushes, and other forms of irregular warfare. Captured Soviet equipment and munitions elevated the Wolverines from a minor nuisance to a developed insurgency capable of inflicting costly losses well behind the front lines. These attacks made them heroes in the eyes of the occupied civilian population, and the Wolverines could depend on food, supplies, and shelter from friendly townspeople, even in the face of horrific Soviet reprisals. While the group originally took the name of their high school mascot, in time, it became a rallying cry, while the Soviets and their allies increasingly saw the Wolverines as the ferocious beasts that were their namesake. Attacks on Soviet re-education centers only furthered their legend, and the spirit of resistance they stirred in the local populace threatened to reignite an entire theater of operations that the Soviets had considered largely pacified. At their height, the Wolverines were considered such a destabilizing influence that they were known by name in the upper leadership of both sides. The United States attempting to reinforce the group with special forces, while the Soviets deployed Spetsnaz to hunt them down. In the face of such odds, the persistence of the Wolverines was nothing short of miraculous. But as the months wore on and the front lines of the Third World War moved farther and farther away, the group was pushed to its limits. One by one, its members were lost in action or betrayed by collaborators who knew their identities. When the Soviet army began to employ the same tactics it pioneered during the fighting against the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, it was too much for the Wolverines to survive. Reduced to half their number, the Wolverines disbanded, but not before launching a final diversionary attack on the local Soviet occupation headquarters that allowed at least some of its members to escape. By the time the Soviet invasion was repelled, the actions of the Wolverines had been largely forgotten, overshadowed by greater victories elsewhere. Today, only a single monument commemorates their struggle, a rock on which they etched the names of their fallen: Jed and Matt Eckert, Robert Morris, Danny Bates, Aardvark Mondragon, Tony and Erica Mason. Children who fought here alone and gave up their lives so that the United States shall not perish from the earth. The Templin Institute investigates alternate worlds and realities. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to directly support us, vote in polls to determine future topics, and receive some cool rewards, please consider pledging to our Patreon page.